All right, we're moving pretty quickly now. We spent a few weeks in the parables in chapter 13, and that has provided the groundwork and the basis now where we can move pretty quickly through these historical chapters in chapters 14, 15, and even over in chapter 16. Last week, we looked at the end of chapter 13 and on into chapter 14. We pretty much almost got through. We're going to call it a hit and a win, and we're getting through chapter 14. And today we're going to look at chapter 15, and if we have time, maybe even stretch into chapter 16 a little bit as well. But the reason why we can go through these chapters more quickly is because we've done all that groundwork in the parables. The parables aren't just some separate nugget of information that has no bearing on what came before or what goes after. He brings these parables, chapter 13, and teaches them right after chapter 12, where he turns away from that wicked generation, and he takes his generation into chapter 13 and teaches them these parables. And we spent several weeks on the parables looking at them, and now when we go in to chapters 14, 15, and 16, they're not just something separate. They flow out of those parables. He's going to illustrate those parables. He's going to show those parables in action as we go through chapters 14, 15, and 16. And we're just kind of put up here on the screen what we looked at last week. We're not going to go read the passages again. This takes us through the end of chapter 13 and on through chapter 14. But we'll just comment on some of these things, what we've seen so far to lay the groundwork. Because you know, when we get to chapter 15, you know what's going to happen? You're going to feel like deja vu. In chapter 15, you're going to see a lot of similar things going on that went on in chapter 14. It's like in chapter 14, he's going to take those parables, put them on display, illustrate them, further interpret them, and then he's going to do it again in chapter 15, and you're going to see similar historical events. There's some minor changes in some of the characters and some of the fine points of the script and that kind of thing, but you're going to see basically he repeats in chapter 15 what he taught in chapter 14. And so that'd be a good idea. That's why I thought it'd be a good idea. At least bring these back to our memory. At the end of chapter 13, when he finished preaching those parables, he went right into the synagogue and in his hometown of Nazareth and begins preaching the gospel of the kingdom. He reads out of Isaiah 61. And he begins preaching. He's sowing the seed. This is how it's going to work during the time between Christ's first coming and his second coming. He's sowing the seed in this synagogue. There's prepared ground in there. There's partially prepared ground, and there's completely unprepared ground. And we saw that the seed that fell on the air-prepared ground, Satan took and used for his own purposes and twisted Jesus' words and his life history. And how can anything good come out of Nazareth? Jesus is just a carpenter's son. The very qualities that qualified him to be their Messiah, according to the prophets, the vain religious system uses to disqualify him and to lead people away from him. And so he gets rejected, sent out of his own hometown. And I suggest there you can see that opposition in the hometown. You have the sower, the parable of the sower, and the parable of the wheat and the tares. What Jesus could have done, and he talks about it earlier, I think it's chapter 10, when he sends the 12 out to go to the cities and preach the gospel to the cities. What does he tell them? And when he comes in judgment, it's going to be worse than Sodom and Gomorrah for them. When he's here in Nazareth and they reject him, he could have gone outside town, called down the fires of heaven and the host of angels and destroyed Nazareth. But he doesn't. He lets them go on. And you're going to see that over and over and over again. The wheat and the tares. The evil is going to coexist with the good. And then the next section of, as we get into chapter 14, the first thing that opens there is we see opposition from the political leadership. That's that vain political system. Most of the time we've been talking about the vain religious system. Now Matthew brings back to our memory this Herod, the son of the Herod from the opening of Matthew, that sent Jesus and his family into Egypt to begin with. And he's now brought this back. There's a vain political system at work in Israel as well. And I would suggest this brings out again, obviously the parable of the leaven. Mark actually in Mark 8:15 describes it as the leaven of Herod. And he goes on to describe the leaven of the Pharisees. So here he's picking up that leaven parable. He's picking up again that wheat and the tares parable. He could have destroyed the religious leader system, but he's going to tell them, and he's going to say this explicitly in chapter 50, let them alone. Leave them alone. Let them remain. So you have opposition from the political rulers. I suggest he's expanding and giving illustrations of the parable of the leaven and the parable of the wheat and the tares. Then we had the miraculous feeding of the 5,000. And there he takes that little bit of food, an insignificant amount, that the disciples thought it's so insignificant, they don't even see it. They have over 20,000 people that are hungry, and they have 5 loaves and 2 fish, and when Jesus asks them how we're going to feed them, they say, well, they need to go back. We need to send them away from you and send them back to town. And of course, Jesus says, no, bring them to me. See, they looked at 5 loaves of fish and 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And they looked at that, and then they looked out at over 20,000 people, and they didn't even notice it. They didn't even consider it. It's so insignificant, it's not even noteworthy. Jesus took those things and turned it into something great. I suggest that could be, is reminiscent of that parable of the mustard seed. And that could also, we could bring in the parable of the dragnet. What did this feeding do? It threw out the net of the kingdom, and it brought in everyone. There are believers out there, unbelievers out there, there's Gentiles out there, there's Jews out there, it just brings in everybody, the dragnet. God will separate the good and the bad fish out there at his return with his angels. So he's elucidating these parables. He's bringing out what they need to know that will be particularly important for them to understand. And here, this feeding idea, he's going to bring up again in chapter 15. It's very important they know about their provision that he taught them about in the Sermon on the Mount. Their provision for food, especially when they get out in that tribulation period, especially the last half of that tribulation period. And then chapter 14, we saw the miraculous control of the sea and the waters. And of course, all of these bring to mind the Exodus account. They're all in the carrying on the Exodus motif. And here we have him walking on the waters, reminiscent of the Red Sea, at the Exodus at the Red Sea, where God parted this, controlled the sea and parted the waters, and they walked through. Here they're going to walk on, and he brings that out. And so that I'd suggest, there you have that hidden treasure, a hidden pearl. Here he sends them out. He says, hop in the boat, hug the shore, and go down to the next city. He goes up in the mountain. He's up in the mountain for several hours. He looks out, and they're not down in bed in the next city down. They're out and still in the boat out in the middle of the sea, being with a tumult trying to swallow them up. And he seeks his pearl. He seeks his people, and he goes out and he seeks them and goes out and walks on that water and delivers them his treasure, this great pearl. And he delivers them from the waves, the wind, the waters. And of course, those are just behind these waves and waters. Whenever you talk about the sea, at the pit, at the bottom of the sea, it's always a reference to Satan and his policy of evil against God and his plan and purposes. And we saw this earlier. Remember when they went to vanquish the armies of Satan on the other side of the sea? And what happened on their way over? There was an earthquake and it tried to swallow them up. That's what Satan's policy of evil is going to be against this believing remnant as they go through that tribulation period. He's going to try to swallow them up before they get to the other side, before they get into that kingdom, and nullify God's plans and purposes for the earth. And here we see something similar. Now they're out in the middle of the sea. The waves are swallowing them up. Satan's policy of evil against them is going to be great. They're not going to be able to deliver themselves. But what they needed to know is they were God's hidden treasure, and He'll seek them out and deliver them. And that's exactly what He does in that on the sea here with Peter and the 12. And let's just pick it up there, and that will lead us down into chapter 15. Jesus walks on the water. Peter starts to walk on the water and then looks away from Jesus. See, this is a great lesson. They need to keep looking at Jesus. They need to stay together as a believing remnant and together be waiting and watching for Jesus. They take their eyes off that and look at Satan's policy of evil against them, it's going to pull them down. They need to keep their eyes. And we discussed this quite a bit when we were over in the book of James. Same type of idea. And Jesus, let's just begin at verse 31. And Jesus, this is chapter 14, verse 31. And we'll close out chapter 14 and move on into chapter 15. And immediately Jesus stretched forth his hand and caught him and said unto him, O thou of little faith. See, they needed, when they got out there in that tribulation against Satan's policy of evil and it's trying to swallow them up, they needed to have great faith, and they will have great faith. He's teaching them now. He went up in the mountain. He left them, that just like he's going to leave them and ascend back to his Father at Pentecost. He's teaching them. He's giving them a practice run through working on their own, and they needed to keep their eyes and their faith on Jesus. He will deliver them. And so he stretched out his hand and caught Peter and said, O thou little faith, wherefore didst thou doubt? And when they were come into the ship, the wind ceased. Jesus brings them in the ship, and the wind ceased. The seas stop moving. The waves stop. Jesus delivers them, his pearl, his treasure. Then they that were in the ship came and worshiped him. See, that's what's going to happen out of the end of that tribulation. They're going to be delivered from Satan's policy of evil against them. Christ is going to seek them out, his treasure. He's going to deliver them, and they're going to worship him. And they're going to say, of a truth, thou art the Son of God. Now we've gone from Daniel's Son of Man, and they realize the Son of Man is the Son of God. Absolute God, absolute deity. And when they were gone over, they came into the land of Gennesaret, verse 35, and when the men of that place had knowledge of him, they sent out into all that country round about and brought unto him all that were diseased, and besought him that they might only touch the hem of his garment. And as many as touched were made perfectly whole. Now we come back to that healing characteristic, kind of like the feeding. It's what draws in that preaching of the kingdom. It's like a big net that just gets thrown out and it pulls people in. Some of the people are not operating out of faith and just coming to Jesus for the healing or the feeding. Some are coming to Jesus out of faith. Some have partial faith, weak faith, like Peter and the 12 here, and some have fuller and complete faith. Some are bearing fruit, some aren't bearing fruit. It pulls in everything. The dragnet, parable of the dragnet, brings everyone into the feeding, everyone into the healing, and they'll be separated out at Christ's return with his angels. And I would suggest here that what's Matthew doing in recording these things? He's recording these parables and their interpretation. we're still interpreting the parables. And he's putting them there, and I'd suggest there you have the parable of the scribe that brings the new and puts the new and the old together. That's the parable of the scribe at the end of chapter 13. All right, so that's what I think ties in. We're not just onto another section of Matthew, and like chapter 13 with the parables was like a book unto itself and doesn't really mean anything beyond that. He's still interpreting the parables. Now chapter 15. Now you should have a little sense of deja vu. If you're tempted to say, Steve, I thought you did this already, well, don't blame me, blame Matthew, because he's basically going to go through the same thing again. Chapter 15, verse 1. Then came to Jesus scribes and Pharisees. So now, how did we open up chapter 14? We had opened up chapter 14 with Herod, the vain political system. Here in chapter 15, we're opening with the scribes and the Pharisees, the vain religious system. But it's going to be the same type of thing happening. It's just going to mean now he's going to bring out the vain religious system, the scribes and the Pharisees. And look at this very important phrase at the end of verse 1, which were of Jerusalem. See, this kicks up the war another notch. This isn't just Pharisees and scribes and teachers and leaders in the synagogue in the Galilee area. Now headquarters in Jerusalem are sending their head chief ruling scribes and Pharisees. Now they're coming from Jerusalem, the headquarters of Israel's religious system, and now they're coming all the way up to Galilee to confront Jesus. And let's see what they confront him with. This is a kicking up of the confrontation, of the opposition to Jesus. These are the leaders from Jerusalem, and they've come to oppose him. All right, verse 2. And here's what they're going to, here's the thing they're going to try and accuse Jesus of. We've seen this in past ones. In Matthew 12, we looked at some things there, and we saw there, he just boils it down to, you don't know anything about God and what he's doing, and you're all just a bunch of hypocrites. Well, he's going to say basically the same thing here. Let's read it. Here's their accusation against Jesus and his disciples. Why do thy disciples transgress the tradition of the elders? They don't accuse them from transgressing the things of God, but the things of their elders, the traditions of men. Let's read further. For they wash not their hands when they eat bread. So now here, you have to get the irony of this. It'll kind of open the passage. There's great irony here. What has Jesus and John and God been trying to get these religious leaders to participate in? All the way back to John the Baptist, they've been trying to get these religious leaders to participate in God's cleansing program for the nation of Israel. And they've rejected it. They've refused God's cleansing program. Beginning back with the water baptism of John, the way it's supposed to work, they're supposed to come preaching the gospel of the kingdom. Anyone believing the gospel of the kingdom, boom, just like Abraham. Hundreds of years before, their faith is counted for righteousness. They're justified unto eternal life before the tribunal of God. It's not based apart from works. They're eternally secure. And now, once they're justified, I guess we could say in the Pauline sense, believing the gospel of the kingdom, their faith is counted for righteousness. Now they're brought into Israel's prophetic program, and now they can participate in Israel's national salvation. And God and John and Jesus have been trying to get the leaders of Israel involved in God's cleansing program. Begins with believing in the gospel of the kingdom, and once that's in place, they generate they're joining into the national repentance, national confession of sins of the nation of Israel, so that they could participate fully in Israel's national salvation and entrance into that kingdom. That's what they've been trying to do. Now get the irony here. They're supposed to be getting involved in God's cleansing program, but they reject that. And now they come accusing Jesus and his disciples of not getting involved in their cleansing program. There's an irony here. He's bringing out this great point, and he's just going to call them hypocrites after this. They're all worried about their traditions of men. That was a cleansing program based on cleansing external things. Like, you wash your hands, or you clean, doubly clean and wash all your dishes and all that, and utensils. And they say that's the important stuff. But when it came to God and his cleansing program, they rejected it. And now they're trying to get Jesus and his disciples involved in their cleansing program. See, it's just a bunch of nonsense. It's just a bunch of foolishness. It goes back to earlier. They don't know anything about God or what he's doing. Verse 3. So let's read through what Jesus' answer is here. He's going to turn it all on their heads again, and he's going to take a bigger transgression. And look what he says here in verse 3. But he answered and said unto them, why do you also transgress the commandment of God by your tradition? See how he's going to turn everything upside down. He's going to show that their traditions aren't complementary or don't encourage obedience to God's command. They throw God's commandments away and replace it with their own commandments. The commandments of men, the commandments of their fathers, commandments of their interpreters, and all the stuff they used to bury God's word. For God commanded, now he's going to give a specific example and then a practice of this vain religious system and show why they're indeed a vain religious system. Verse 4, for God commanded, saying, honor thy father and mother, and he that curseth the father and mother, let him die the death. Well, there you have, right out of the Ten Commandments. One of those commandments with associated blessing. And here you have, this is the way all the commandments worked. There's the commandment, and if you break the commandment, the penalty is being put to death. And here you're to honor your father and mother, and if you don't, what their vain religious system was supposed to do is put them to death. But look what the vain religious system did instead. And we've seen this back in the Sermon on the Mount as well. Verse 5, but ye say, whosoever shall say to his father or mother, it is a gift, by whatsoever thou mightest be profited by me, and honor not his father and mother, he shall be free. Now what's going on here, there is a practice in the vain religious system whereby they would receive the money or the gifts or the support that you should have given your elderly parents or your parents in need for whatever reason, and you could give it to the vain religious system instead. You could pay your vows, you could do your gifts and what you owed the religious system, and you can make that a gift to them. And then you could go back to your parents and say, well, I gave a gift to the vain religious system. Of course, they're not going to call them a vain religious system. I've given my gift to the religious system, and now I don't have any more to give to you. And the vain religious system, look what the vain religious system comes along when they allow that to be done. Verse 6, and honor not his father or mother, and this is what the vain religious, he shall be free. God's word, God's commandment, it says he shall be put to death. This vain religious system gave them a way to ignore God's commandment and not support their parents and would honor their parents in whatever way that might be for them. And they would absolve them of their guilt, absolve them of the penalty. They'd praise them, they'd improve their reputation, well, they'd enrich the vain religious system while the parents continue to suffer. See, his point here is the vain religious system isn't complimenting or encouraging ways to keep God's commandment. They're throwing away God's commandment, providing the means to ignore God's commandment, and replacing it with their own traditions. Thus, have you made the commandment of God of none effect by your tradition? So that's what they were doing. And the same thing as point in bringing this examples of, he gives a much greater example than even the cleansing one. And if that's true for thou shalt honor thy father and mother, well, then it's more true about your petty little cleansing thing. Verse 7, and he calls them exactly what he called them earlier when he was dealing with them. Ye hypocrites, well did Isaiah prophesy unto you, saying, this people draw neareth me with their mouth, and honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. But in vain they do worship me, teaching for doctrines the commandments of men. This is actually, he's quoting from Isaiah 29:13. Why don't we just turn there and read it right from the source. Isaiah 29, verse 13. Isaiah 29, verse 13, and here Isaiah is explaining why Judah and Jerusalem are going to enter into that fifth course of punishment. And of course, the first installment of the fifth course of punishment is that Babylonian captivity. And he's explaining why they are going to go into that fifth course of punishment and go into Babylonian captivity. And the reason is, or at least the major reason is, their vain religious system that was leading the whole nation astray. Look at verse 13. This is Isaiah 29, verse 13. Wherefore the Lord said, for as much as this people draw near me with their mouth. See, that's external, just words and mouth. External things. And with their lips do honor me. But it's just lip service, we might call that today. They're just giving me lip service. But have removed their heart far from me, and their fear toward me is taught by the precept of men. That's what he's getting at in Matthew. The issue for these people isn't external utensils and hands and things like that. It's the internal heart that's the issue. It's the inner man that's the issue, not those external things. Therefore, verse 14, therefore, behold, I will proceed to do a marvelous work among this people, even a marvelous work and a wonder. For the wisdom of the wise men shall perish, and the understanding of the prudent shall be hid. See, he's going to deal with these people. Of course, we know from the parable of the wheat and the tares, it's not going to be right away. But he's going to deal with them. And they're not going to, and the kingdom isn't going to run on that wisdom. The kingdom isn't going to run according to the commandments of men. The kingdom isn't going to be run based on the precepts of men and their human teachers. Verse 15, Isaiah 29:15. Woe. Notice at the end of verse 14, I just want to bring out a key word here. For the wisdom of their wise men shall perish, and the understanding of their prudent men shall be hid. Notice the hiding concept here. Woe, verse 15, unto them that seek deep to hide their counsel. What's our parable of the leaven? What's that prophetic woman of wickedness, Satan and his policy of evil going to be doing? They're going to be hiding the leaven of the Pharisees, the vain religious system, among the wheat piles, the wheat seed, the children of the kingdom. Woe unto them that seek to hide their counsel from the Lord, and their works are in dark, and they say, who sees us? Who knows us? And the point is here, we won't keep reading, the point is that one day at the end, when Christ returns with his angels, it's going to be, according to Matthew 10:26, it's going to be all uncovered. It's going to be all revealed. It's going to be separated out, and it'll be made known. All right, so back to Matthew 15 here. Matthew 15. So he's drawing their attention to the fact that the problem isn't external cleanliness. The problem is internal cleansiness. God has been trying to get this vain religious system, has been calling out to them to enter into his internal cleansing program. And they've refused. And now they're confronting, the irony here, they're confronting Jesus and his disciples, trying to get them to participate in their external cleansing program. You see, it's a joke. It's just a bunch of nonsense. It's just a bunch of foolishness. They're just a bunch of hypocrites, verse 7, Matthew 15, verse 7. So why do we call this a vain religious system? If you want to know, we saw this in James, and we see it here, verse 9. But in vain they do worship me, teaching for doctrines the commandments of men. That's the vain religious system. And we saw this especially in the Sermon on the Mount. Remember, he's drawing attention to the heart issue. What is the main function of that Sermon on the Mount? What's Christ do when he's teaching that Sermon on the Mount? He goes and he's digging and digging and digging, and he finds the lump where this law is, and he just starts peeling off the cover. He's like, oh, we got to get rid of man's traditions. We got to get rid of all these false teachings. We got to get rid of this vain religious system and their commentaries and their interpretations. Just rip all that stuff off. I know the law is down here somewhere. And eventually he rips it all off, and there he brings out the pure, shining law. And why does he do that? Why is that one of the first things Matthew talks about? Because what's the main provision of the new covenant? I will put my law within your heart. And he'll give them the Spirit to cause them to do it. He can't put the law in their heart if it's covered over with the teachings of the vain religious system. He had to peel all that off. And what he goes through there, and he gives all those examples. Everything, this is how this is supposed to come out of the heart. This isn't about external cleansing. This is about internal cleansing. And he purifies the law. He purifies the commandments so they can put it in their hearts. And it's a heart issue. It's not an external issue. And back in the Sermon on the Mount, we could turn there, but I think we all remember it enough to just talk about it. There, what did he talk about? He's like, you see, the vain religious system doesn't know what they're talking about. They focus on the external act of murder. But he says, see, the murder isn't the real problem. Murder is just a sign of the real problem, the external sign of the real problem. The real problem is the hatred in the heart. You get rid of the hatred in the heart, you'll get rid of the murder. You get rid of the internal hatred of the heart, you automatically get rid of the external murder. And he gives another example, that adultery. They focused on adultery, and then they provided ways for people to commit adultery, and it's kind of like what he does here, honoring your father or mother. He gives them ways that they can be excused from guilt. But he says the main issue isn't the external act of adultery. The external act of adultery is just a symptom of a greater internal problem, and that's lust in the heart. You deal with lust in the heart, you automatically deal with adultery. So that's what these Pharisees were missing. All they wanted to focus on were these external things, when God wanted to deal with their hearts. And he's been, the first step is that for this vain religious system have been to receive the gospel of the kingdom, receive Christ, enter into Israel's prophetic program and the nation of Israel's salvation, and participate in that. And that would have cleansed their heart and automatically cleansed everything external. But instead they rejected that, and now they're trying to drag Jesus and his disciples into their external cleansing program. It's just a bunch of nonsense, and the great irony, and it's a great irony here. All right, and as we close those verses, well, let's just finish reading this section. And he supports this by verse 11. Notice now he says in verse 10, and he called the multitude and said unto them, hear and understand. Remember, we had two groups, two parables under the heading of instruction, and that leads to understanding. The parable of the sower, the parable of the scribe. Verse 11, not that which goeth into the mouth defiles a man, but that which comes out of the mouth that defiles man. Then came his disciples and said unto him, knowest thou that the Pharisees were offended after they heard this saying? Why were they offended? Because they knew Jesus was talking about them. Verse 13, and look what Jesus' answer is here. Now this is what Jesus could have done. He said, everyone clear back, and he could have brought down a stroke of lightning from heaven and a host of God's angels and wiped out these vain religious representatives. But what does he tell them to do instead? Verse 14, let them alone. Does that sound like a parable? Like maybe the parable of the wheat and the tares? Where God's going to plant. Notice he's even going to pick up on the planting concept. What did the wheat and the parable say? God's going to plant the children of the kingdom, and Satan's going to plant the children of Satan, and they're going to coexist during this time between the first and second coming. They're not supposed to uproot them. But look what Jesus says here, and look how that fits what Jesus says here to the disciples about the Pharisees. Verse 14, let them alone. They be blind leaders of the blind. And if the blind lead the blind, both shall fall into the ditch. There's that irony concept. They dig their own ditch, and then we watch them fall into it. Irony. Verse 15, then answered Peter and said unto him, declare unto us this parable. See, he's still talking about the parables. Verse 16, and Jesus said, are you yet without understanding? See, his instruction, we learned in the parables in chapter 13, is supposed to lead to an understanding. And they're still not understanding, so he's going to give them some more instruction. Do you not, verse 17, yet understand that whatsoever entereth in at the mouth goes into the belly and is cast out in the draught? What you take in from the inside, if the body doesn't want it, it just goes through. But those things, verse 18, which proceed out of the mouth come forth from the heart. See, he's bringing out that heart issue again. And that's what defiles a man. It's the condition of the heart, the inner man. That's where, if there's, you can address murder and adultery all you want, but if there's still lust and hatred in the heart, it's not going to mean anything. What defines a person isn't his external cleansing of utensils or external parts of his body, it's the cleansing of his heart. It's a heart issue. And they were rejecting God's heart cleansing program for the nation of Israel. And they were instead using substituting and replacing it with their own religious system and traditions of men. And so verse 19, for out of the heart proceed evil thoughts. See, it's out of the heart. The heart is what needs to be cured, not the hands. Out of the heart proceed evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, fornications, theft, false witness, blasphemies. These are the things which defile a man, but to eat with unwashen hands or off a dish that has a little bit of dried food on it or something, see, that's not what defiles a man. It's what comes out of the heart that defiles a man. And these Pharisees had rejected God's heart cleansing program and replaced it with their trivial, vain, external cleansing program. And were trying to drag Jesus and his disciples into that. It's just nonsense. It's just foolishness. They're a bunch of hypocrites, just like we saw in chapter 12. And so now let's go to the next section here on the Syrophoenician woman. Now we get a healing one. I just suggest at the end, as we leave this confrontation, this opposition from the vain religious system, as we went through there, I pointed out a bunch of the parables. And so one was the sower, the parable of the leaven, the parable of the wheat and the tares. And you could probably bring out aspects of the other ones as well. He's still interpreting. He's still elucidating. He's still instructing on the basis of those parables we read in chapter 13. Now let's go to the next one. Now, so in chapter 14, we had the vain political system. Chapter 15 opens with the vain religious system and opposition from them. Now we go to a healing, which we also saw in chapter 14. This is a special healing, though. This is the Syrophoenician woman, which means she's a Gentile. So let's pick it up at verse 21. Then Jesus went thence, and went away, and departed into the coasts of Tyre and Sidon. Now out there, he's going further and further out into the promised land, and he's going into what would be a mostly Gentile area. So he's going to get more Gentiles. And sure enough, verse 22, and behold, a woman of Canaan came out of the same coast. What's, if we translated the word Canaan, do you remember from our parables what it translates into? The merchantman, and cried unto him, saying, have mercy on me, O Lord, for thou son of David, my daughter is grievously vexed with the devil. So now she comes. She's obviously close enough to the Jewish world. She understands some of the teachings there. She has obviously some background information, some basic understanding of how Israel's program works. And she comes, she thinks she's going to approach Jesus on the basis of Israel's Davidic Covenant. She approaches him on the basis of thou son of David. She thinks she'll be able to get him to bless her on the basis of the Davidic Covenant. So she has some understanding. She knows some of the things they talk about, but she doesn't have complete understanding because Jesus can't bless her on the basis of the Davidic Covenant. He can bless her on the basis of another covenant, but not the Davidic Covenant. What's the Davidic Covenant? The Davidic Covenant is God's promise to David that he would enflesh himself into the line of David and through as the only Israelite and become the only Israelite who could save the nation of Israel from her sins. Could deliver and save the nation of Israel. It's the salvation package for national Israel. He would become and be their redeemer. And what does John say? He dies for his friends. See, it's not the same aspect of the death on the cross that Paul brings out. He died for his enemies. In the Davidic Covenant, he dies for his own people, for his friends, for the Jews, the Israelites. And then he'll deliver and avenge, deliver them out of their trials and from their enemies and destroy their enemies. That will be by the time you get to the end of the tribulation period. That happens. And then he ushers them into that kingdom. He'll be their king and their blesser. It's all about national Israel. And when this Gentile woman comes to Jesus and appeals to him on the basis of that Davidic covenant, look what he does. Verse 23, but he answered her not a word. Now wait, let's just see how this works. What if it was a Jew that came to him and appealed to him as the son of David? Flip back a couple pages to Matthew 9. A few pages to Matthew 9 and verse 27. And we're going to see another one. Now we have Jews appealing to him as the Son of David. And look at how the story changes here. Matthew 9, verse 27. And when Jesus departed thence, sounds a lot like what we just read at the beginning of this account, 2 blind men followed him, crying, saying, Thou Son of David, have mercy on us. And when he was come into the house, the blind men came came to him. And Jesus saying to them, Believe ye that I am able to do this? They said, Yes, Lord. And then he touched their eyes, and saying, According to your faith, be it unto you. And their eyes were opened. Does he ignore them? Does he turn them away? Does he ignore them multiple times? No. They appeal to him, a Jew appealing to him on the base of the Davidic Covenant, and he opens their eyes. Now, go back to Matthew 15. And now here you have a Gentile approaching Jesus on the basis of the Davidic Covenant. And look what he does. Verse 23. But he answered her not a word. He didn't even see her. She wasn't even there. He just kept going. And his disciples came. Now his disciples come, and even they have enough understanding. You see, now Gentile commentators and historic Christianity come along and they say, well, this isn't very nice of them or whatever. This is people that can only be written by people who don't understand anything about the Bible, because they are doing exactly what God's word calls for. Peter and the 12 weren't ignorant here or mean or anything. They were operating according to God's plan and purpose. And based on that Davidic covenant, Jesus couldn't bless this woman. And the disciples recognize that, and they want to send her away. She keeps coming, she's following, she's calling out to them. Jesus is totally ignoring her. And they're, let's just send her away. We're getting tired of hearing it. And then he drives home the point more. You think, eventually he's going to heal her, but look how many times he first says he's not going to heal her. Look at verse 24. But he answered, now surely he's going to positively respond to this poor Gentile woman. But look what he says, verse 24. But he answered and said, I am not sent to you. I am sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Based on that Davidic covenant, he's only sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. First, he had to save Israel, the nation of Israel. That is what that Davidic covenant is based on. Then came she and worshipped the Lord, worshipped him, saying, Lord, now she doesn't appeal. She doesn't quite. You get the idea if you follow this through and think about it. She's gone from running ahead and appealing to him. Surely this will work. I'll appeal to him on the basis of the Davidic covenant as the son of David. Well, that didn't work. Now she gives another response, and she's thinking about this. What's the next step? And so this is kind of like a pause statement. Like she's thinking, she doesn't quite know how to go forward. She goes, well, Lord, help me, help me. And then look what he says to her. Now surely Jesus is going to respond positively to this poor Gentile woman. Verse 26. But he answered and said, it is not meet to take the children's bread, Israel's bread, and cast it to the dogs. Wow. What does she do next? When she appeals to him on the basis of the Davidic covenant, there's nothing he can do for her. Now she's had time to think. Her message has changed. First she appeals to him on the basis as a son of David, that Davidic covenant. Then she thinks maybe I'll just appeal to him on general humanity, helpfulness. That didn't work. Verse 27. And she said, truth, Lord. Something clicked into her thinking. She's putting the pieces together. And she says, yet the dogs eat of the crumbs which fall from the master's table. Now she appeals to him not as a recipient through the Davidic covenant. She appeals to him as a recipient of the Abrahamic covenant. The Abrahamic covenant says, I will bless those that bless me, and I will curse those that curse me. she comes and she blesses him. And now he can bless her not through that Davidic covenant, but through that Abrahamic covenant. And look what he does in verse 28. See what he said about the dogs feeding at the table. The dogs feeding at the table clicked in. It made her realize she's not a direct recipient of the Davidic covenant. She'll be a direct recipient of that Abrahamic covenant. And now look what he does, verse 28. Then Jesus answered and said unto her, O woman, great is thy faith. He doesn't even say that about the disciples usually. And he says about her, she's put it together. She's put together his plan and purpose. She's in line with what God's doing, and now he can bless her. Great is thy faith, be it unto thee even as thou wilt. And her daughter was made whole from that very hour. So when she appealed him on the base of the Davidic covenant, that was the mechanism for how God's going to save national Israel. He doesn't even hear her. She's not there. But when she comes and assumes her position in that Abrahamic covenant as recipients of indirect blessing, once national Israel has been saved through the Davidic program, God's going to make her the head of the nations, and with Israel and through her rise, he's going to bless the rest of the world, the rest of the nations, the Gentiles. It'll flow out of the table, off of the table of Israel. And when she appeals on that basis, he responds, and her daughter was made whole that very hour. Then he goes on, he's going to do some more healing here. He's going to be doing some more healing with regard to that. She had no privileges or rights under She had no privileges or rights under the Davidic covenant, but she did under that Abrahamic covenant. And now look what he does for the rest. He goes back into what would be mainly Israelites now, Jews. There's still going to be Gentiles. Galilee is what do they call the Galilee? It's the Galilee of the Gentiles. Verse 29, and Jesus departed from thence and came near unto the Sea of Galilee, and went up into the mountain and sat down there. And great multitudes came unto him, and having with them those that were lame, blind, dumb, maimed, and many others, and cast them down at Jesus' feet, and he healed them. Insomuch that the multitude wondered when they saw the dumb to speak, the maimed to be whole, and the lame to walk, and the blind to see. And look what they did. They glorified God. They responded positively to Jesus Christ and his ministry at this time. And so we have that healing aspect, and we saw that also back in chapter 14. All right, so I'd suggest when we look at this, we see the parable of the dragnet. The preaching of the kingdom is just going to go out, and it's going to draw everyone in. The parable of the dragnet and bringing about the interpretation and further illustration of those parables he gave in chapter 13. All right, let's go ahead now. Remember in chapter 14, it opened with the vain political system. Chapter 15 opened with the vain religious system. There was several accounts of healing in chapter 14. There's several accounts of healing here in Matthew 15. And now we're going to read another one. What was the third thing that happened the second thing that happened in Matthew 14 was the feeding of the 5,000. Now he's going to repeat it. And now we have the feeding of the 4,000. So this must be an important lesson. Chapters 14 and chapter 15, and really on into chapter 16, we'll see, keep duplicating themselves, triplicating themselves. He's teaching them the lessons they need to know from those parables so that they respond positively out in that tribulation, especially out in that tribulation period. But beginning at this time, they'll have a foretaste of these things at Pentecost, and then especially as they go through that tribulation period and on into their kingdom. So now let's look at the feeding of the 4,000. It sounds like deja vu. We've been all through all this before, but so this must be important. They needed to remember the Sermon on the Mount and the provision he gave them for their daily bread. And they needed to exercise that. They failed the first time, and they're pretty much going to fail the second time, but they're not going to fail out there. They will out there. They'll be great in faith, and they'll respond positively. He's teaching them these things. They're failing now, but they're not going to fail out there. And that's why Matthew's recording them here, so they can read about this when they get out there in that tribulation period. So Jesus called his disciples, verse 32, unto him and said, I have compassion on the multitude because they continue with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat, and I will not send them away. Remember in Matthew 14, he left the door open. What should I do, he asked them. And what did the disciples say? They said, send them away so they can go down to the village and get their McDonald's meal. And Jesus said, no, bring them to me. Now Jesus doesn't even give them the choice. Jesus tells them the answer without asking them the question. Look what he says here. He says, verse 33, at the end of verse 32, I will not send them away fasting lest they faint in the way. Now this is, while there's fewer people here, it's a more extreme situation. You get the idea from the feeding of the 5,000 in the previous chapter that it was just been a day. Nobody was going to, keel over and die of hunger because it's just been this day, occurred during this day. Now he specifically says it's been 3 days. Well, now that's a little more dire predicament. I don't know about you, but I couldn't last 3 days without eating. Or if I was, I'd probably be in pretty bad shape. So he's now anteed it up, and he doesn't even ask them, should I send them, how should I feed them? He doesn't even do it, because they probably would have said, send them away again. And he says, I'm not going to send them away. He answers the question without asking the question. And he says, he's going to bring them to him and feed them. And look what their response is here, verse 33. And his disciples say unto him, whence, from where, should we have so much bread in the wilderness? You got to wonder, they just fed more people than this in the last chapter, but it's not clicking yet. And so where are we going to get enough food to feed all these people? Chapter 14, it was 5,000 men. Here we have 4,000 men, which means in chapter 14, it was more than 20,000 people, most likely. And here it's more than 16,000 people. And look what they say. And Jesus said unto them, how many loaves have you? And they said, does all sound familiar? Kind of like deja vu. And they said, 7 loaves and a few little fish. And he commanded the multitude to sit down on the ground. See, he has over 16,000 people here who've been hungry for 3 days. And all they got are, what is it this time? 7 loaves of bread and a couple little fish. See, the disciples are still looking at that and they don't see anything. They haven't grasped the parable of the mustard seed. God's going to take something that to them is insignificant, not even worth taking notice of. It's so, when it comes to feeding 16,000 people, it's just nothing. It's not even worth taking into the equation. And Christ is going to take that and he's going to turn it into something great. Verse 35. And he commanded the multitude to sit down on the ground. And he took the 7 loaves and the fishes and gave thanks and broke them and gave them to the disciples and the disciples to the multitudes. And they did eat and were filled, and they took up broken meat that was left, 7 basketfuls. And they did eat. Were 4,000 men, besides women and children, more than 16,000 people. And he sent away the multitudes, took a ship, and came to the coast of Magdala. And that's where we'll end it for today. At the end there, we'll pick it up, maybe look at a couple more details in the feeding, and then go on to chapter 16. Guess how chapter 16 is going to open? With the vain religious system. It's like going to start the whole thing over again. And that's where we'll pick it up next time. All right, let's close with a word of prayer.